Hi everyone, welcome back to another anatomy video. In today's episode, we're going to look at the different vertebrae as well as your sacrum, sternum, and ribs. So we're going to start off by looking at your cervical vertebrae. First, we're looking at C1, which is basically just the first vertebrae within your cervical. It is also named the atlas, and it is the only vertebrae that does not have a body or a spinous process. So for C1, what do you have? First of all, you have your vertebral arch, which is basically just going to be this whole portion that kind of looks a little bit like a bridge area. So this is your vertebral arch. Then you have your horizontal articular processes, which are going to be these portions up here at the top. The difference between processes and facets is that processes are like the actual projection, while facets is just a smooth portion. So again, it is your horizontal articular process or horizontal. Okay, there we go. Now that's spelled correctly. So I'm going to write a little note over here on the side. So process equals projection of bone, while a facet is just a smooth portion in the bone. Okay, next you have your transverse processes, which is going to be these projections over here on the side. And again, these are transverse processes. Processes just is like the plural form of process, however you guys want to say it. Then you'll see that there is this hole that is in the middle of the transverse processes. The hole is named the transverse foramen. And again, foramen means hole. Next up, this big hole that is in the center, that is your vertebral foramen. So this whole portion is your vertebral foramen, and that is where your spinal cord is gonna go through. All right. Now we are gonna go on to C2, which is your second vertebrae. For the most part, this is all that you need to know for C1. It's pretty simple because there is, again, not a body and not a spinous process, so it's very rudimentary stuff. C2, it has a lot of the same stuff. So again, it's going to have your vertebral foramen, which is the hole in the center. It's going to have your transverse processes, which are the projections out to the side. It's going to have the transverse foramen, which is the circle going through the transverse processes. And then there is a couple different portions that you guys need to know. The first of which is your spinous process. That is this projection that you guys see over here, this whole portion. I kind of think of it as the trunk of the vertebrae. So that is your spinous process. It is also spelled out right over here for you guys. Then you have your vertebral body, which is going to be this portion over here. It is basically just a circular / oval shape. For the C2, it has this little ball up on the top of the vertebral body, and that is called your dens. C2 is the only vertebrae that has a dens, and that is how you can differentiate it um, from other vertebrae. So C2 is the only one with a dens. All right. Next, instead of calling it the horizontal articular process, as is seen over here with C1, you are going to have your articular facets. And again, facet is just a smooth portion. So you can see how this over here, it looks a lot smoother than this kind of like rough projection over here. This one, it's a little bit elevated. It looks a little bit more rough, while this one looks a little bit more smooth. And so that is what differentiates it and makes it a facet. Next, you have two different regions of your vertebrae. The first region is your lamina. The lamina is in between your transverse process and your spinous process. So it's going to be this whole portion over here as well on this other one. And then you have your pedicle is the next region. The pedicle region is going to be in between the vertebral body and the transverse process. So it's going to be this over here. I kind of think of it as like the neck leading to the head. So the vertebral body in my mind is the head, and then the pedicle is the neck. So that is the difference between your lamina and your pedicle. Lamina is in between the spinous process plus transverse process, while the pedicle, I'm actually going to enlarge this so that it's easier to see. The pedicle is in between the vertebral body and transverse process. All right. Now, we're going to go on to what all of the other cervical vertebrae look like. So, the rest of these cervical vertebrae are basically going to be C3 to C7. So, C3 to C7. So, again, you have lots of the same stuff. You have your vertebral body over here, your transverse processes, transverse foramen, your vertebral foramen, the spinous process, your articular facets, lamina, and pedicles. And then the main two differences is that for C3 to C6, so I will write it over here on the side, but for C3 to C6, they're all going to have a bifurcated spinous process. A bifurcated spinous process basically means that the spinous process is going to have kind of this camel hump. So it has this U shape in between it, and it makes these two little humps over here. That is what it means to have a bifurcated spinous process. And that is only on C3 to C6. Next, another thing that is good to know is that for C3 to C7, you're going to have a eusinate process. The eusinate processes are basically going to be little devil horns that are on top of the vertebral body. Since this is a superior view, you aren't going to really be able to see it, but if I were to draw it out a better view, it would basically look like this. So this is what the vertebral body would look like. And these 2 points over here and over here, these are known as your eusinate processes. And again, C3 to C7. So now that is everything for the cervical vertebrae. Next, we're going to look at the thoracic vertebrae. The thoracic vertebrae looks a little bit more like a giraffe because of its long spinous process and also its transverse processes are going to be a little bit more prominent and stick out more. So you have all of the same factors. You still have a vertebral body. You're going to have a vertebral foramen again. The only main difference is that you have transverse costal facets, which you can see over here on the sides. These are your transverse costal facets. Then your articular facets are going to stand up a little bit more vertically. So these are the superior articular facets. They stand up more vertically, while you see over here, it stands up a little bit more flat than it does up over here. Next, you have your demifacets. These over here in blue, these portions, and on this vertebrae over here and over here, these are known as your demifacets or your demis. So only the thoracic vertebrae has demis, and only the thoracic vertebrae has costal facets. So you need to include the word costal. And I will write that down over here on the side so that it's easier to remember. So thoracic has demifacets. Oops, there we go. And transverse costal facets. So that is the main difference and pretty much the only difference. All right, now we're going to move on to the lumbar vertebrae. The lumbar vertebrae, in my opinion, is the easiest to remember because it doesn't really have any unique factors to it. It's pretty much just a general vertebrae. So again, you have the vertebral body. The vertebral foramen would be a hole up here at the top. You can see it on this top view. That hole is your vertebral foramen. Then you have your spinous process over here, your transverse processes over here, the pedicle, again, vertebral body to transverse processes, and then the lamina would be over here, spinous process to transverse processes. Again, you have your articular facets and processes as well over here. So processes is this projection, and then facet is on the projection, but it is just the smooth portion. So on an exam, if they have the bones out and they ask what is the smooth bone, then you would say facet. If it is asking for the projection, then you would say process. And it's always good to raise your hand during exams. Ask your professor, are you talking about the projection or the smooth portion? And based upon their answer, you can differentiate whether it is the process or the facet that they are asking for, which is a really great test taking tip that I can give. All right, now we are going to go onto your sacrum. So your sacrum has a lot of the same things. You are going to have the body over here. It is the top circular portion. So that is going to be your body. Then you have your sacral canal, and you can see that it is labeled over here, sacral canal. If you take a pipe cleaner and stick it down there, you'll see that there is a hole and it is able to go under the bone, and that would be the sacral canal. And where it comes out here at the bottom, the other side of the sacrum, you're going to have another hole, and that is called your sacral hiatus. So think of it as a hiatus is you are taking a break from something or kind of like a mini vacation. So you are leaving, and the sacral hiatus is on the bottom. You are leaving the sacrum. Next, you have your sacral foramen, which are all of these holes along the top of the sacrum bone. Then you have your median sacral crest, which is this little projection of bone over here, and you can see that it's spelled right over there. That circle wasn't too great. I'm gonna erase. There we go. So median sacral crest over here. Then you have your coccyx or your coccygeal. The biggest portion over here, the top of it, these projections, that is known as your transverse process of the coccyx. So transverse process of your coccyx. And then the rest is just your coccyx or coccygeal. Finally, the last portion is going to be this side area. I always think that this kind of looks a little bit like an ear, and that is why it is called your auricular surface, because the Greek and Latin root for ear is like AUR. So this is your auricular surface. It is on the side of your sacrum. All right, that is everything for the sacrum. Now we are going to go to the sternum. So zooming in, the first portion is your manubrium. The manubrium is this whole top circular area, and you can see it is spelled over here, manubrium. Then you have your jugular notch, which is basically going to be this dip at the top. That is the jugular notch. Next is your manubriosternal junction. That is the line that separates this circle from this oval-shaped portion of the sternum. So this line over here is known as your manubriosternal. There we go. Next, you have the actual body of the sternum, which is, as I said, this whole oval-shaped portion of it over here. And finally, the last portion is your xiphoid process, spelled with an X. So it's Xiphoid, and it's basically just going to be this little piece of bone that is at the bottom. That is your xiphoid process. The line that is separating the body of the sternum from the xiphoid process is known as your xiphoid junction. So just as you have a manubriosternal junction, you have a xiphoid junction as well. All right, finally, last portion is your ribs. So for your ribs, you have your vertebral end, which is basically going to be this whole region over here. And that is your vertebral end. That is because this is the region that connects to most of the thoracic vertebrae. So the 12 vertebrae that are in your upper back region. Then you have your sternal end, which is going to be this flatter portion over here because it is going to connect to your sternum bone. So that is your sternal end. So now you have the head of the rib. The head of the rib is basically just going to be this whole portion over here. Your neck is going to be right next to it. It is that whole portion in between the head and the tubercle. So the tubercle is this kind of like flat little smooth looking surface over here. That is your tubercle. It's a little bit of a projection as well. Then you have your costal groove. You can see that there is an indent on the rib over here in this region here, and then that line that really defines the groove. That is your costal groove. And then that is pretty much everything that you need to know about the ribs. You don't really need to know your articular facets or your body, but depending on your professor, you might need to know the difference. But that is everything for this lecture. I hope you guys found it informational. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, leave them in the comment section. Please like and subscribe for more videos in the future. And I hope you guys have a great day. Bye and thank you.